I'm Lee Moore.
I'm Rob Moore.
And this is the Chinese Literature Podcast. Rob, today we're coming to the end of the novel.
The end of the journey. We've journeyed to the west.
All the way to the end and back to the east.
Yes. We'll eventually get back to the east.
And this may be the end of the
Maybe
series.
the last one. We're working hard, dear listeners, to schedule a follow-up discussion with a colleague on multimedia adaptations of this, of which there are many.
As I think we discussed in the very first podcast, this novel has been hugely influential in Japan and Korea.
Yes.
Even in the U.S., I mean, you can kind of think of the Pokemon phenomenon as kind of an extension of Journey to the West. It's not exactly the same thing. It's not derived from the same thing, but there are elements of it.
Yes, and we'll try that. COVID being what it is, me getting ready to move as I am, scheduling can be tricky. So hopefully we'll get that done. If not, this will be our last podcast on Journey to the West because we have journeyed long and well.
You're right, Rob. We have journeyed long and far. In fact, we've traveled 5,048 days, gotten 5,048 scrolls.
That's a lot of journeying. I should point out, dear listener, that the scrolls that Lee talks about, well, you'll hear about momentarily. We're going to talk about the scrolls they receive, which was the whole point of the journey in the first place. But the numerology there is no accident. Numerology figures pretty heavily throughout this. And not even in a sort of a coy way. It's fairly standard throughout Chinese classical fiction. Anyway, so the end of the novel is, as you might expect, the quintet arrives at the Thunder Monastery. It's, for me at least, one of the most interesting parts of the whole text because it doesn't end the way you think it's going to.
So we should point out when we had our last episode, they were crossing what is today modern Xinjiang, going past the Flaming Mountains, which is, if you're traveling from Chang'an or modern-day Xi'an to India, that's via Central Asia. That's kind of the halfway point. The novel doesn't really do that much with the journey back. The chapters that we're looking at today, chapters 98 through 100, kind of literally leap over much of the rest of the previous journey.
Right, and we've talked about how this entire novel is largely a Buddhist allegory, and of course, once you have reached enlightenment, there's not really much else to struggle with, right? So it makes a great deal of sense that once they've gotten the scrolls and achieved enlightenment and received their rewards, that the return journey would be fairly easy because the journey itself on the way to the Thunder Monastery was always meant to be a series of trials and tests that they were supposed to be helped through by the Buddhist pantheon.
And we should point out that this entire journey, so you mentioned earlier in the podcast that this journey, the purpose of this journey was to go and get the scrolls, the scriptures. But in fact, there is another metaphorical level. Symbolism.
Go for it.
The metaphorical level of this journey is that each of these characters is growing as an individual, and in facing these challenges, they are reaching Buddhahood at the end of the novel. So it's not just about bringing the scrolls back to China. It's about each of those as an individual. The five main characters, that is Monkey, Jubaje, Pigsy, his name is Pigsy, and then Sandy and the White Horse, and of course Tang Monk. All of them become mature Buddhist and attain enlightenment. And if you read each of those characters as a single individual, that is, they are five components of a single person, there is kind of this other metaphorical level that you can understand this novel by. That is, Monkey starts out by being kind of difficult to restrain, like incredibly difficult
nearly
to restrain.
Impossible to restrain.
To the point that, remember, I don't think we talked about this, but at the very beginning, Tang Monk has to put this like chain or this kind of metal strip around his head. And Tang Monk, just by saying a special spell, is able to essentially tighten it over Monkey's head to the point where he's like getting his skull crushed painfully.
Yeah.
That's no longer necessary. In fact, at the end of the novel, Monkey asks Tang Monk, "Hey, can you take that off now that I'm a nice, good Buddhist? And he does. All right, now for a very brief summary of chapters 98 through 100. We won't hit everything, but just really quickly, they arrive at the Thunder Monastery. They ascend the Thunder Monastery. They get the scrolls, but it turns out they don't have a gift that is necessary to actually get the scrolls. So the guys who are giving them the scriptures actually end up giving them just completely blank scriptures. And it's kind of a bad thing. And so they find this out as they're traveling back, and they go back and they're like, hey,
what's the deal?
What's up? Yeah. Anyways, they're like, the Indian Buddhists are like, well, you didn't give us a gift.
There's a formality here. There's a way to do things.
But they also make the point that you're too dumb to handle these empty scriptures, because actually all of the truth of Buddhahood is attainable within these empty scriptures. So we'll actually just have to, give you the real ones because you're too stupid to understand this object lesson. And then so they travel back through China. They're on a magic turtle crossing a river.
Which sounds like an acid trip. I'm sure someone's had that exact sequence happen to them.
If not, after listening to our podcast, they certainly will.
Yeah.
Anyways, they're crossing a river on a magic turtle, and the Buddhist deities go, hey, they actually haven't achieved the magic number of adventures that they were supposed to have, which I believe is
81.
No, is it 81 or 91?
9 times 9.
Oh, yeah, sorry. My math is bad. I was going to say 91. 9 times 9.
91. Look, we study literature, not math. Again, this is not a zoology podcast, and it's not a math podcast.
So we can't tell the difference between a turtle and a tortoise.
Or numbers. That's fine.
Anyways, so they're supposed to have 81 adventures. They only have 80. And so the Buddhist deities kind of get the turtle to leave them, I was going to say high and dry, but it's the exact opposite.
Low and wet.
Anyways, the scriptures get wet. Monkey, because he has attained enlightenment, he is able to protect the Buddhist scriptures somehow when they get into the water, but they do get a little wet, but they don't get kind of
destroyed.
Yeah. And we should point out here, remember the Marum Epstein reading, right? This monkey is the ultimate yang figure, and that is highlighted in the text. And yang is associated with heat. That is, maleness equals hotness, and femaleness equals coolness. So monkey, using his ultimate manness, is able to protect the Buddhist scriptures from the water. They dry them out. They leave them on the rocks to dry out. Some of them kind of peel onto the rocks, so they end up losing a lot of the scriptures, which kind of becomes a just so story for why China doesn't have all of the scriptures. And that feeds into Buddhist theory later. But they take the scriptures back. They go back to the Tang emperor. He's like, hey, this is great. And then they just kind of celebrate. And then the chapter 100 is very listy. I don't know if you... It's just kind of like a bunch of different lists of things with some... I hesitate to call them plot, but it's just a bunch of lists about accomplishments and things.
So part of this is a just so story to explain why China doesn't have the full scriptures.
And that plays into Zen Buddhism, because Zen Buddhism, which in China is actually Chan Buddhism, so the Japanese version is derivative of the Chinese version, they claim that they are filling in some of the blank spaces for a lot of these, which is, the origin of a lot of kind of Chinese innovations to
But what's
Buddhism.
interesting to me about the exchange, this is the thing that sticks in my mind about these chapters that I keep coming back to, is when they arrive at the Thunder Monastery, Tripitaka, who effectively is God in this realm, he's sort of the head honcho, says about the quintet, it's great that they came here to get the scriptures, and I'm so happy they're here. The thing is, the land that Tang Monk comes from is so violent and dirty and backward and stupid that we can't actually give them all the scriptures, right? Like, we can maybe give them the greatest hits of our sutras, right? And I find that fascinating, because it's kind of a letdown. You travel this whole way, and then you're waiting for the triumphant return with all the scriptures, and in fact, no, it doesn't happen. but B, it's a not so subtle commentary on the state of China at the time when Wu Chang'en was writing this novel. To claim that retrospectively China is not nearly as far along as it should be in terms of its realization of the ideals of Buddhism is an interesting thing to weave into a novel like this.
So it's interesting. So you mentioned this kind of question of Chineseness, and I find this novel, one of the things I love about this novel is that it's so fascinating because it seems to be going towards these two extremes of and how it contemplates Chineseness. On one hand, it's a novel about people leaving China because China doesn't have something. China lacks something. And the novel is very open about this. And Buddhism, in some ways, especially in its earlier forms, is a very kind of, it's understood to be an anti-Chinese religion when it arrives in China. Yeah. So I'm particularly thinking of Han Yu's discourse on the Buddha's bone, where he says, he hates Buddhism. Han Yu does. And this is a Tang Dynasty figure who's one of the most impressive writers from the Tang Dynasty.
Which is saying something.
Right? Anyways, he just destroys Buddhism as this kind of anti-Chinese religion. And that discourse has always been there in Buddhism, and it comes out in this novel as like China's not really that great. China has to go kind of borrow stuff from India and other places in order to be complete. But what's interesting in this novel is at the same time, other chapters will be kind of praising China. So in some of the earlier chapters, I think 10 through 13, if I remember correctly.
When Tang Monk is being chosen to go choose the scrolls.
Tang Monk is chosen by the Tang Emperor, and there's all this kind of praise for how awesome China is. 98, so chapter 98 that we're looking at today is very much down on China. It's just kind of like the Buddhist deities in India are kind of like, well, they're not very smart.
I don't want to take all our sutras and just throw them down the garbage disposal that is China, right?
But chapters 99 and 100 are super pro-China, I think.
Or pro-Tang court. See, this is where we get into tricky sort of territory.
But I would argue that in this novel, the Tang court is understood in terms
sort of the essence of China.
Exactly, right? Like, and that's still to a certain degree true today, that the Tang is understood as the essence of all that is great about China.
Classical culture, yeah. In the early chapters you mentioned, one of the things that I find fascinating, though, about the emperor's sending out of Tang Monk is it's not from a position of power, but humility. The emperor goes, holy cow, you're right. We do not have all the sutras we need. We're lacking all this stuff. We need to find someone to go get it, right? And so they find someone to go get it. And that's an interesting one because it positions the Tang emperor, or at least in classical culture would have been the apotheosis of everything that is good about China, is humble. He's positioned as this figure who has a lot of power, but recognizes his limits and his lacks and knows how to go and get what he needs, right? And in the end of the novel, you get that as well. The Tang court is presented as very opulent, but mostly they're super excited to finally have this thing that's going to make them better. So it's a combination of denigrating and praising China, but even when the novel's praising China, it's always praising some element of humility, I think.
So if we look back to Volume 1 of Anthony Yu's translation on page 290, there is a ton of stuff about how awesome the Tang court is. And yeah, I just really kind of, there's almost this kind of whiplash with the concept of China in this novel, where you'll go from one chapter and it seems like it's kind of dissing China, and the next chapter it's praising China as the center of the world, and then it goes back to, well, not really.
Well, maybe it's the terms that are interesting, though, right? Because you're right that the Tang court is praised as opulent, powerful, maybe possessed of a great deal of intelligence and all that, but it still recognizes that it lacks something. And then at the end of the novel is suitably impressed to get the thing that it lacks.
So if I could just read a quote from Anthony Yu's translation, this is volume 4, so we're in chapters 100.
Chapter 100.
Excuse me, chapter 100. So upon their arrival, that is the arrival of Tripitaka and his 4 disciples, upon their arrival at the hall, they saw the opulence of the great nation of China was indeed different from all ordinary kingdoms you see. And then it has a long poem talking about how awesome China is. So that kind of back and forth, like China is the greatest, the center of the world, it's the greatest thing in the world. China's not really all that great. China's the greatest. China's not that great. It's jarring.
And what's really fascinating to me, and it's fitting that this is our last podcast, at least on the text itself, is that this is one of the quintessential Chinese novels. This is literally one of the 4 great novels of the Ming.
The 四大名著.
四大名著. Okay.
The 4 great famous
works of the Ming. Yeah. It's...
No, sorry. That Ming is not Ming Dynasty Ming. That's Ming as in well-known, having a good name.
Oh, right. Okay, thank you. Yes. That's a very important distinction.
The other, so since we're here.
Yes.
The 三国演义, 西游记, the 水浒传, and so Hong Lo Meng is sometimes presented in that, but Hong Lo Meng is not a Ming Dynasty novel. It's a Qing Dynasty novel. Originally, I think it would have been Jingping Mei.
So those would have been the Romance of the Three Kingdoms, Water Margin, and then Dream of Red Chambers or Story of the Stone. Although that's like, as we said, it was written in the Qing. But it is a quintessential Chinese novel, but it presents Chineseness in such a problematic way. Far more problematic than I think it's popularly presented. You have Monkey, Sun Wukong, who is easily the most identifiable fictional character in China. He's the Mickey Mouse of China, right? Or because I'm getting ready to go to France, the Asterix of China. Like this figure that if you put him up on a billboard, everyone will know immediately who he is, right? Immediately. And yet, his entire existence in the novel is, as you say, designed to go outside of China to bring something back to China that it lacks.
And he's a figure who may have been derived from non-Chinese sources, and at the very least, what he does in the first 7 books of the first 7 chapters of this novel is undercut all of this Confucian order and try and overthrow it. And that's why he's interesting, is because he's not a Confucian character. He's overthrowing this kind of imperial Confucian rhetoric.
He's chaotic. We keep coming back to this because we're a broken record this way. The first 7 chapters really are just fantastic. But the reason this is all fascinating to me is that there's a certain element of circling the wagons in today's China. We could debate endlessly about why it is that way, but certainly in the history of Chinese literature, some of the most famous stuff has always come out of an exchange, an interchange between other cultures and other literatures.
So May 4th is coming out of this interchange between Chinese literature and Western literature and Japanese literature.
And that is not to denigrate. It's not to say, well, Chinese literature isn't really even Chinese. It's just kind of global. No, it's not. But it is very interesting to see what the classics have to say about what it means to be Chinese. Now, you and I are definitely not experts on what it means to be Chinese, but from the perspective of this novel, which is certainly addressing Chineseness because it keeps going back to the Tang Court and talking about what's wrong with China, etc., it's a lot more fluid than you imagine classical sources presenting.
And I would say it's also much more fluid than it is represented in its contemporary manifestations. When you have this novel, it's like it's represented as if it's the ultimate Chinese novel, but actually, it's problematic.
Even when you think about it, except for Tang Monk, all the other characters are immortal beings. They're not even Chinese. They don't come from a place in China. It's not like Pigsy was born in, trying to think of a good obscure Chinese city name, but
Hanzhong.
There you go. Thank you. No, I know, Bengbu. I stayed the night in a actually just a dismal place in the middle of Yunnan province called Bengbu. There were like 5 houses. Anyway, he's not from Bengbu. He's not from anywhere in China. The only one who's actually from the land of China is Tang Monk. All the rest are from effectively somewhere else. Now, we can kind of speculate endlessly about what all this means, and it will be fun to do so because we're literary students, etc.
And we've had lots of beer thanks to our Patreon.
We actually haven't had
listeners.
lots of beer. This is one beer, but it's a very strong beer. I always recommend drinking a strong beer when reading Journey to the West.
And using acid.
Well, I don't think you need to if you've read Journey to the West. As a kind of wrapping up thought here, there are a lot of ways to come at this novel, as we've already talked about. One is simply an adventure novel. I would argue that it's a little tedious.
You can read it as with the Marm Epstein reading.
Right. But you can also come at it from the standpoint of cultural observation. Why is this novel as popular as it is? Part of it is the figure of Monkey. But part of it is also a remarkably cosmopolitan presentation of China. That China is a place that is both very, very powerful, but also humble enough to know when it needs something that it doesn't have and can send people to go get it and bring it back. It is interesting to me that the scrolls are things that are sent to China, as if everything's sort of eventually going to go to China anyway. So there's a lot of power and a lot of humility there. There's a lot of stuff you can do with this novel in terms of commentary on what Chinese identity is.
And of course, Anthony Yu is a scholar of religion, so he would read it, I think, predominantly as a Buddhist metaphor, a Buddhist allegory. There's that reading.
Good point.
I want to ask you something, Rob,
Yes.
before we close.
Yo.
Now that we finished this novel,
Yo.
do you feel enlightened?
It's a very good question, Lee. I'm at the end of my graduate school career as well. I would say that I probably lack an adventure. So if you know where I can find a magic turtle in a giant river, that would be great.
All right, I think that's a great place to end it, Rob. We'll go look for that magic turtle in giant river.
Thank you so much.
I'm Lee Moore.
I'm Rob Moore.
And this is the Chinese Literature Podcast.